Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone here. For those of you that are visiting from USC, welcome to the LMU campus. If you're wondering, this is autumn day, so our students actually have the day off from classes. This is why you're wondering why there's so few students around. That's why here. For those who don't know me, I'm Amir Hussain. I teach here at the Department of Theological Studies at Marymount University. Delighted to welcome you all here. This is an event that we're doing with the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities at USC. So there's a number of folks here who come from USC. I don't think it's a secret to say there's some issues with funding of the Institute of Humanities, so it's great that LMU is able to provide at least this opportunity to have this meeting, which we scheduled. I want to thank a couple of folks from the LAIH, Adina Aaron, who's the admin assistant, Janice Littlejohn, Leo Brody, who's just making his way up the aisle here, Louise Steinman and David Ullin, who are the directors of the LA Institute of Humanities. Here at LMU, I want to thank our Dean's office for helping to fund the lunch that you had. So it's a lovely sort of connection here. And so the plan, such as it is for Jack and I to talk with each other for about half an hour and then have a little bit of a conversation with you all. So thank you again for being here. I would typically say Jack needs the introduction, then just stop and start talking. But for those that don't know Jack, you should know Jack Miles. As I forgive me for saying this while you're here, one of the great, people of letters, in America. Pulitzer Prize, Guggenheim, MacArthur Grant for his first book, God, a Biography. Christ, a crisis in the life of God, God and the Quran, which I use in my classes about comparative theology, the editor of the North Anthology of World Religions, emeritus distinguished professor of, I believe, English literature and religious studies at UC Irvine, and a dear friend. And I want to start just by telling that story of how we met. And funny moment, because you can remember this, because I don't remember it, I have the letter. November 20th, 2002, I'm teaching at Cal State, Northridge. I taught at CSUN until 2005. And I get this letter with an envelope from the Getty, and I'm like, why is someone from the Getty writing to me? I open the letter. And it's Jack, who at that point was the assistant to the director of the Getty, Barry Muniz. And he starts by saying he's read an article that I've written in the Journal of the American Religion. My dissertation looked at Muslims in Canada, specifically focusing on Toronto. One of the things I looked at was Canadian Muslim reactions to Salman Rushdie's satanic verses, what happened there. That part I spun off into an article in the Journal of American Religion. Jack read that article. And again, I don't mean to embarrass him, but it was just one of the most beautiful letters, because there was no sense of, oh, by the way, you know who I am. And think, oh, here I am, I read your letter. I'm also interested in religious literature. I'm also, done some stuff on satanic verses. Would you like to come to the Getty and have lunch? And I'm like, yes, I would very much like to come to the Getty and have lunch with you. And so that's always stayed with me, that sense of, I don't mean to say senior, but certainly a more distinguished scholar, reading something by a very junior person, and saying, oh, this is kind of interesting. Can we sit down and talk about this? And I've always admired that about you, Jack, the attention that you pay to folks. So I want to thank you publicly for that.
Well, thank you, Amir. It was a pleasure for me after making Amir's acquaintance in that way, and I had been quite caught up as literary editor of the Los Angeles Times with the satanic verses controversy. We were really in the thick of it. To see how Amir's career went on from that moment there he was as an assistant professor at Cal State Northridge. And next thing I knew, he was here at Loyola. I'm an ex-Jesuit. So this was kind of fun to see my new Muslim friend becoming a professor at a Jesuit university. But that was just the beginning. Eventually he became the chairman of the theology department here. And then he became the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, which is the professional association of professors of religious studies and theology. And then he became the president of the organization. And what does he talk about in his presidential address? Well, here's where you discover that our friend is not an American Muslim, he's really a North American Muslim, because he's Canadian raised. And he also has Mexico on his mind, and so one of the subjects, well, there were two principal subjects of his presidential address. One was, because we were in San Antonio, and we come from Los Angeles, why are there so few Latin American or Mexican scholars in our organization? The other subject was what he was turning to next in his own research, which was Hank Williams. You don't necessarily expect American Muslims to be specialists in country music, you know, but you know that's where we find ourselves with Amir Hussain. And you know, in this book, so many things to talk about here, but one thing I'm just going to pick a nugget, you know. Tell us the story of the Turkish Sufi background Muslim Ahmet Erdogan and how he fits into American life and your interest in music.
Thanks for that, Jack. And so, so Jack knows my love for music. I say this all the time. I think in music, you know, I'm not a musician. My wife Joan is here. She's the musician. Mark Sweat is here. You know, music critic for the Times. I'm not at all a musician. I don't know music. I don't know those kinds of things. You know, but I love music, and that's how I think. And when I was a grad student at the University of Toronto, I won a sort of prestigious Canadian doctoral fellowship, and the treat for myself was something I'd wanted for years: the Atlantic Rhythm and Blues box set. You know, I would argue that you can't tell the story of America in the 20th century, not American music, but America in the 20th century, without the story of Atlantic Records. Created, this is Jack's point, by a Turkish Muslim guy, Amir Erdogan. Amir Erdogan was the son of Mehmet Munir Erdogan, who was, I think, the second ambassador of the Republic of Turkey to the United States. You know, was in D.C. Amit, who
And he asked for somebody's autograph.
Yeah, so that was so Amit's sort of one of his claims to fame is when his dad was, and I love the British, the ambassador to the court of St. James's, like plural, I think, is you know what was in London. So he was there before he came to America. Amit asked a young American, relatively unknown singer for her autograph. You know, really, really interesting and kind of moment there, because I think, I don't mean to say, you don't want to connect yourself to these folks in this way, but I think Amit clearly thought in music as well.
Who was the?
Yes, sorry, First Lady of American Song, Ella Fitzgerald.
Yes.
You know, and she was singing, I can't remember whose band she was singing in, but she was singing in a band there, and he, you know, took notice of her. He was a teenager, you know, and you know, like you can imagine a teenager coming up to this woman asking for her autograph, who would, you know, then be out, you know, extraordinary.
But you know that he was a producer, obviously with Atlantic Records, and that's both the talent and the deepest payment. If you're in publishing or you're not the talent, you're the person who finds the talent, but you have to believe that you have something in front of you that is different, that is real, that is strong, that is good. And he saw that, because she wasn't yet the first lady of jazz, you know, so.
And then he, when he's in America, you know, Dad's in DC at the consulate. DC in the 30s wasn't the happening, exciting place it is now. He crossed over to the black neighborhood by Howard University, listened to music. And so went to St. John's in Annapolis. Like it's funny because I actually teach occasionally. Have been asked in the current administration to do this, but in the previous administration to teach at the Naval Academy, which is right next door to St. John's in Annapolis. Created with his Jewish friend alone from their dentist, Atlantic Records, you know, and did this amazing music. But there he was, this American Muslim guy, Turkish born.
What was his particular sympathy as a Turkish Muslim with American blood?
Yeah, and I think, and thanks for that, because he saw, like, you have to remember, this is the 30s and 40s in America, and, you know, Muslims then were still the Turks. You know, the Ottoman Turkish Empire had ended just a couple of decades earlier. Muslims around the world were still known by folks outside Muslim world as the Turks, you know, because of that, and the sort of anti-Muslim prejudice. And he saw that. He saw the connection between the prejudice that he got as a Turkish Muslim guy and the prejudice that African Americans got. And so with his brother in New York and other places, they did some of the first sort of integrated concerts, dances, things like that, you know, bringing people together precisely because of that shared experience of knowing what it's like to be discriminated because of not so much the skin color, but the religious identity with African American identity.
When you're the member of a minority group, you're always noticing when a member of your group scores big, makes it in the real world, in the big world. When I was running the Los Angeles Times Book Prize program, one year we gave an award to Neil Gabler, who's the author of An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood. And in his charming little acceptance speech, he said when he was a kid, his mother and father would take him to the movies on Saturday afternoon to escape the heat in whatever neighborhood they lived in. And his father would immediately fall asleep, and his mother would immediately start whispering to him about people on the street. You see her, she's Jewish. You see him, he's Jewish. That's what it's like to be a member of a minority group. You're aware of whether the person you're dealing with is one of you or one of them, you know. And this is true of Catholics too, right? And the supreme example of this I recall, world's fattest man. So, you know, this book begins, the first half of the book is like Islam 101. It's the course that Amir teaches here, and that he has, and also in the second half is Amir as teacher, not in the classroom, but I would say in America, dealing with what it is like to be called on again and again and again, to be the Muslim in some kind of public conversation. I want to turn to that a little bit later. But, you know, I'm not quite a beginner in the study of Islam. I've written a book myself called God in the Quran. But there was something that I discovered here, Amir, that I had never come across before. And I'd like you just to say something about it because I found it so affecting, and that is the year of sadness. Tell us about the year of sadness.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So in the book, as Jack said, I talk about basics of Islam. One of which is, you know, who is the Prophet? Who is Muhammad? Why is that life important? And I think for all Muslims, there's kind of a connection to the life of the Prophet Muhammad, precisely because it's not this life of wealth and privilege. You know, if you don't know that story, his father dies before he's born. His father's a caravan trader. He's in what is now probably Syria, you know, on business while the mother is pregnant. So born into a family, patriarchal, who your father is important. You don't know your father. Your father dies when you're born. His mother dies when he's 6. He's raised by his grandfather, who dies when the boy's 8. At the age of 8, he goes into his uncle's home his father's brother, who raises him, marries a marvelous woman who's older than he is, Khadija. They have no sons that survive past infancy. It's not a patriarchal society, it's also a tribal society. The tribe, the sons are valued more than daughters. He has 4 daughters. He loves his daughters. Girl dad, I'd call him today. 3 of them die before he does. So he does what no parent should have to do, bury 3 of his kids. But to Jack's point, 1 year, 9 years into him, in 610s when he gets his first revelations, his wife, Khadija, dies. And then a few months later, his uncle, Abu Talib, dies. And in them, I think both in the Islamic tradition, and we have with this Professor Hussain, who's a marvelous scholar of Quran, early Islam, I think there's much more attention given to the death of Muhammad's uncle, Abu Talib, because with the death, his uncle, to Muhammad's consternation, never becomes a Muslim. Retains the sort of pre-Islamic sort of polytheism of the day, but protects his nephew, who is a monotheist. The uncle that takes over has no such interest. And so things get much worse for Muhammad physically, because sort of physical persecution happened. I don't think there's as much attention paid to the death of his wife, Khadija. And you think about this, like, they've been married 25 years. Muhammad's just about 50 years old, so like half his life he's been married to this woman. She's the mother of their daughters. What's that like? And I love that it's known in the Islamic tradition as the year of sadness, the year that his wife dies, the year that his uncle dies. And again, I think that sense of, this is a human person and the full humanity of that person. And I think, I'll stop here. I think this is why, as I understand, why Nikos Kazantzakis wrote The Last Temptation of Christ. For Kazantzakis, as an Orthodox Christian, he thought, everyone should have a relationship with Jesus. But a lot of folks get hung up on the divinity. Jesus is both fully human and fully divine. How can I be like that? I'm not God. Well, he's also fully human, and that, I think, was Kazantzakis' ideal in Last Temptation of Christ. What about the fully human part? What about the person that's tempted? What about the person that has all the sort of human desires that we all have? Isn't that something to reach out? That, I think, is the case for Muslims, precisely, because there's no issue about Muhammad's divinity. He's a fully human person, but he's a human person to whom real tragedy happens.
You mentioned, the way he describes Muhammad's early life. It's a bit like being a foster child, handed around. And if you're a foster child, you've had that experience. You might take into adulthood a sensitivity to the welfare of children, an awareness of what you're dealing with along those lines.
Yeah, well, and it's fascinating you mentioned that, because I'm smiling as I say this, because on Wednesday, I'm the external examiner for a PhD dissertation at Edinburgh, which unfortunately for me is going to be on Zoom and not being right in Edinburgh. But it's actually a dissertation looking at orphans in Islam and Christianity, and that's part of the argument of the dissertation. Is like, in the Islam tradition, you literally have the prophet being an orphan. And so I'm not saying the Hebrew Bible doesn't talk about orphans and widows, of course it does, but that sense of concern, particularly because this is Muhammad's own experience.
I said that the book has 2 halves, and in the first half you get Amir Hussain as professor, in effect, professor here at LMU. In the second half, we have Amir as sort of representative of Islam, dealing with non-Muslims in our country, or maybe in our continent. And this book had an earlier incarnation, you might say. So it is the second edition of it with a revised title, appropriately revised. Builds on the experience that has taken place over the 20 years that separates the two. And I'm going to just read a little quote here from the book, page 106. In the last century, Amir writes, before the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, I would begin my courses on Islam with biographies of the Prophet Muhammad. I used a critical historical biography written by a non-Muslim, as well as a standard biography that told the story in the way Muslims understand it. This allowed us to compare the Muhammad of history with the venerated prophet of the Muslim faithful. I did this because prior to 9/11, my students had little knowledge about Islam. The non-Muslim students were eager to learn, and the Muslim students wanted to know more about their own tradition because they had never studied it before. In January of 2002, when I taught my first post-9/11 class on Islam, I realized that this approach would no longer work. The students were no longer oblivious to Islam. Unfortunately, however, almost all the information they had was wrong. Since almost all of their information came from the media and not from contact with actual Muslims or scholars of Islam, this is where it gets for me really interesting. What do you do at that point? What do you talk about? Do you say, do you go into your apology for Islam? No, that's not what he did. Instead, he used a small book written by Neil Postman and Steve Powers called How to Watch TV News. Let's teach them how to separate the wheat from the what's the word?
Chaff.
The chaff. The wheat from the chaff when watching TV. The book exposed a common misconception among my students that television news tells the truth, when in fact it is often driven by a demand for entertainment value, ratings, and advertising income. So take it from there.
And thank you, Jack. And then this is 2002, when this is network television news. No smartphones, none of the kinds of social media sorts of things that we have now. And the problem is, I can't think of the order of magnitude worse, kind of thing. And so one of the things we've done here at LMU is we do first year seminars, part of which is across the board with all of our 1,500 or so first year students, to give them some sense of information literacy, to give them some sense of what are scholarly sources and the difference between scholarly sources and opinion pieces. And again, now, think about now with the age of AI, where it's so difficult to tell because it's that person with their voice, but they're saying things that person never said. So this was in those quaint days, when you didn't have any of that kind of technology. I use now another Neil Postman book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is great because Postman wrote that post 1984, and 1984 when the cutting edge technology was Sony Betamax, that what if we'd gotten it wrong with the focus on 1984? What if Huxley got it right in Brave New World, that the future to be feared was not a future where totalitarian government controlled information, but a government which had access to any kind of thing you wanted. You didn't care because you had your screen and your narcotics, and you think about it, and I think so. Those that know me know this, those that don't know me will be shocked and amazed that I believe myself to be the only adult human being who has never owned a cell phone. And so, that whole social media thing with our students, would frustrate me times. I realized, they were born our first year students were born in 2006. Smartphones are 2004 maybe, so they've never known a world without smartphones. This is who they are. This is what they do. That's how they mediate reality. In this kind of way. How do you teach them? What is in fact these quick notions of truth, and I would say truth, justice, American way, but I think that's Superman. But just those kinds of things. How do you teach them? How to separate what is sound, sensible information, and what isn't, regardless of whether you're talking about Islam or Catholics. And then there's a funny connection there. Tom Rausch, who's one of our many Jesuits here, one day taught in our department for decades. One day, poked his head into my office. Said, "Oh, Amir, what are you working on?" I said, "Oh, I'm working on a piece about images of Muslims on film and in film and television." And he just gets this big grin on his face. Says, "Yeah, you think Catholic priests have it easy? You think when people see a picture of me in a collar, what's the first image? Sex abuse scandal, pedophilia, all those kind of." And so it's a really interesting kind of moment that we have this. And again, it goes back, and I was talking about, just to finish up, just, the real serious, network news, not schlock news, not anything like that, where it's about ratings. And, I don't mean to put Joan on the spot, but, before she was a teacher, she worked for NBC News in Burbank. And when I was teaching at CSUN, she came in one day to talk to my students as someone, okay, here's someone who actually works in news, who works at Channel 4 News in Burbank. And it was the day after the funeral for the Columbia, not the Challenger, but the Columbia that, in 2003 had exploded, and it was post 9/11, there was worries, is this terrorist? No, it turned out to be a flaw. NBC's lead story was the funeral, the memorial for the Challenger astronauts killed. ABC and CBS did the California thing, car chase. ABC and CBS crushed NBC in the ratings. So it was obvious, next time I have a choice, I'm gonna show the car chase. Because more people watch the car chase, which means we can charge more to our advertisers because more eyeballs are watching. I would argue that the funeral of the Challenger astronauts may in fact have been, subjectively the most important thing to happen in America the day before. I would argue the car chase was not the most important thing to happen in LA that day. But that's what led the news, because car chases make for great television. And that was the issue 2003. 2025, a whole lot different.
I remember, I think it may have been even at an LAIH talk, Jeff Collin, then the dean of the School of Journalism and Communication at USC, said, everyone thinks that the media is getting them wrong, and they're all right. We do our best, he said, but we can't get it just so. We can never talk about you in the way that you think you would talk about yourself. You just have to be as compassionate toward us as you are toward yourself. Amir and I have someone important in common. We probably have more than one person in common, but we are both students of Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who is a Canadian and was definitely a crucial teacher for Amir. He left Canada and was at Harvard when I was doing my doctorate there. I never had him as a teacher, but the man I was sharing my apartment with was studying Islam and did have him as a teacher, and so Cantwell Smith and his wife were guests once in a while at our apartment. He said so many things that we could quote, but one is, when it comes to religion, we always compare our ideals with their behavior. We never compare their ideals with our behavior. That is, I think, the lesson that has to be brought into any conversation, any debate of an interfaith character. I love this cover. Explain the cover.
Yeah. And so, as I tell authors, make sure you let the publisher pick the cover. I'm not designing the cover. So Fortress Press did this cover, which is great. And so the top half you may recognize is one of the windows at Notre Dame. The bottom half is the calligraphy from the dome in Hagia Sophia, built as a church by the Byzantines and converted to a mosque by the Muslims. And so I love that sort of juxtaposition of the sort of Christian imagery of the stained glass window and the Islamic imagery of the calligraphy.
It sort of says in one sudden image that the two have a great deal in common, whatever separates them. So, should we go into questions?
Yeah, I think that's great because we've got about half an hour, 20 minutes or so. So conversation, questions there from folks. Leo, so can I go out and pass the mic around?
You stay here and I'll walk.
No, I just wanted to go back to what you were talking about at the beginning a little bit. And it's certainly true in a lot of religious traditions that the isolation of the prophetic person in some way. Joseph gets rejected by his family. It's all over the place. So I wanted to just ask the both of you, what do you think happens then? What is this repatriarchalizing that happens when a religion gets institutionalized?
No, that's a great question. And so, one of the things that I talk about in the book, that the second half of the book, as Jack mentioned, is the sort of one of the issues of attention. One of them, of course, is around the issues of women, gender issues, which are huge in the Islamic world. I'm not saying they're not huge other places, but that they're there. And I think this is precisely the point, that if you look at the Prophet, this was a man to whom women were important. His wife, Khadija, his daughters, the kind of relationship there. The problem is that the circle that gets inscribed becomes a male circle. The interpretive circle that gets developed becomes a male circle. There are women. There's no prohibitions on women, studying this text or understanding this text. And in fact, if you look at the standard Muslim story, the first manuscript copy of the Quran is given to Muhammad's involved in polygamous marriages after his wife Khadija dies, to his wife Hafsa. It's an interesting sort of moment there. But I think it is that moment, and I'm thinking out loud here. There's a great article, I want to say 1970, by Fatima Mernissi, one of the great sort of Moroccan sociologists, feminists, called Shrine Worship as Women's Religion. And she talks about the case in Morocco and says, okay, so you're educated, you're a woman in rural Morocco and you have an illness. Well, you have two choices. You can take the bus, go to the hospital, try and get treatment. You speak Berber, the doctors in the hospital, of course, are French or French trained, so they speak French. You have to have a translator. You have to get there. You have to do this thing. You have to pay for the treatment in advance. Or you can go to the shrine and ask the saint for healing. The shrine spaces are women's spaces. And she makes, back to Leo, your point, she makes an interesting thing. You have a lot of conservative folks in the Muslim community that say, well, Muslims shouldn't do this, you shouldn't have saints, you should have this direct relationship with God. Why are you doing this? And are they doing this for the theological point, or are they doing this because the shrine is the place where women are? The shrine spaces, and I'm not saying in the exclusive Muslim world, I would say the same thing in the Catholic world, tend to be more female sort of spaces, where, again, not to pick on all the marvelous Jesuit priests in the audience here, but it's the same kind of notion of, what do you do, if you're a woman and you have this kind of connection with a religious tradition that says, I'm going to get in trouble, so I'm going to stop there. But that same sense of, women are running these sorts of places. I think that's the issue, and that's been the crucial one, I think, for Muslims. How do you get away from some of those kinds of reinscriptions of patriarchal sort of gender norms within the tradition? It certainly is a thing that Muslims are working on, and so I'm going to stop here. But I begin that section on women in Islam with perhaps the first Muslim woman that you think of when you think of women in Islam, Gigi Hadid, the supermodel, who's not that far away from here, who happens to be a Muslim, happens to be a Palestinian Muslim, sort of tweeted about things, got in some trouble with some of the issues there. But it's not so is Gigi the first person you think of when you think of Muslim woman? Why not? Because she happens to be a Muslim woman, and you sort of turn it on its head. Now, you understand that she's exceptional in lots of different ways, but I think those are the kinds of ways to think about it. Yeah, you have all these really strong, powerful Muslim women who are trying to make those kinds of changes that are happening in other traditions.
Hi, this is fascinating to me as a Jewish person. His father was the first Jewish American historian of Daniel Horst back in the day. But I'm going to ask you an impossible question, which is, suppose you had to explain, I believe that religions basically have the same fundamental values, so you get down to the bottom. But suppose someone said to you, explain the most important difference between Islam and Christianity, what would you say?
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting question. I think part of it has to do with the person of Jesus, who of course is central for Christians. Like for Muslims, and I'll start with this story. I worked a couple of years ago on Story of God with Morgan Freeman. And that was, I think, Mr. Freeman's sort of selfish pursuit, I say that in a good way, of trying to understand about religion. Because he was not particularly a religious, sort of a person, but he happened to be in Turkey, shooting one of the Chris Nolan Batman films, on his day off, gets a tour of Hagia Sophia, and the director of the museum, because when you're Morgan Freeman, you don't have the docent, you get the director of the museum giving you a personal one-on-one tour, points to the famous mosaic in the ceiling of Jesus and Mary. And he says, and I can't do the voice because the voice is sui generis, he's like, wait a minute. You told me that this was built by the Emperor Justinian back when this was Byzantium, and these were Orthodox Christians. I understand Orthodox Christians have mosaics, they have this beautiful mosaic of Jesus and Mary, I get that. But then you told me that this was conquered by the Muslims, and they changed it from Constantinople to Istanbul, they changed it from a church to a mosque. Why would they leave the image of Jesus and Mary? And the director says, well, Mr. Freeman, Jesus and Mary are important to Muslims. And he was like, I did not know that. And if that's Islam 101, what don't I know? So I think back, John, to your question, for Christians, the focus on Jesus, who for Christians, and it's funny to me that Christians explain things in front of priests, is God who comes to earth in human form. For Muslims, he's a prophet, Now, that's one thing. Muslims are much more like Jews in the sense of the non-Trinitarian sort of theology, but like Muslims, like Christians and Jews, for Muslims, it's love of neighbor, love of God. There's a great, and I'll stop here, there was a great document that was issued by as wide a range of Muslim theologians as you could think of to Christian theologians, all Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, called A Common Word. And what they talked about was, isn't it interesting, that the great commandment, in the Gospels, when Jesus is asked, what's the great commandment? Well, as a good Jewish boy, recites the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What's the second commandment? You should love your neighbor as yourself. For Muslims, same two great commandments. Love God, love your neighbor. And so I think there's these really interesting similarities, and that's to your point, John, about, Judaism, other traditions, of course, have the, worship the deity, love your neighbor, treat your neighbor, with respect. I think that the difference is sort of the person of Jesus, that then leads to all the kinds of interpretive differences, what are the texts that you value in it? Because in a funny way, Islam comes into a world after Judaism and Christianity. So I think Muslims do to Christians what Christians do to Jews. Here's the historical first tradition, then you got this movement that says, oh, we're in continuity with you, but here's a new covenant, a new relationship with God, a new set of texts to describe that. And for the Jewish Christians, what do you mean a new covenant? We're perfectly happy with this. What do we mean New Testament? We're perfectly happy with this thing. Islam comes along 700 years after Christianity and says, we're in continuity with you, except here's a new person, Muhammad, who represents a new relationship. Here's a text that talks about that new relationship. What do you mean new? What's wrong with the old relationship there? And so I think that would be my sort of first sort of fundamental point there.
First, thank you. This is every bit as wonderful as I hoped I knew it would be, knowing the speakers. The Hagia Sophia mural that you spoke about, because I was there and I studied it as a recovering medievalist. My memory is that it was whitewashed, and it was only, it survived because it wasn't destroyed. But it was whitewashed when it became a mosque. Yeah. And then it was 12th century, I think it was 12th century. But the reason for the whitewashing wasn't that Jesus and Mary, and I think John the Baptist is in that too, were not important to them, but because images were prohibited. Yeah. So the iconoclastic feature aspect of Islam.
For those that don't know it, Carol Wells, who's just asked a question, marvelous person, the founder of the Center for Study of Political Graphics, and so images, icons, absolutely. And so that iconic, but again, that goes back to John's question too, that Islam comes into a world that knows Christianity, that knows particularly what we talk about as Eastern Christianity, Orthodox Christianity with the icons, you know, and you come in, and it's marvelous to be in this room with folks like Father Alexi Smith, you know, who's the ecumenical officer for the Archdiocese, but comes out of the Melkite, you know, the Greek Catholic tradition. And so really, really interesting kinds of things. Like, you know, you go into an Orthodox church, what do you see? The iconostasis, you know, the screen that holds the icons, you know. And so that's what Muslims, you know, in the 7th century would have seen, you know. And so there's a sense of distancing yourself from that. In the same way that, you know, when students ask me, well, why is it that Muslims worship on Friday and not other days? I'm like, okay, if you want the Muslim answer, the Quran is clear. Friday, the Quran calls Friday the day of Jummah, congregation, prayer. You know? And so Muslims are supposed to pray, you know, the Friday prayer congregation. If you ask me as a scholar of religion, it's because the Jews already had Saturday and the Christians already had Sunday. You're trying to create a distinct community that is not Jewish Christian, so you're trying to say, yeah, we're not Christians who have this kind of images. What that means, though, is you have all sorts of really interesting images of Islam, and I'm delighted. I think the last time I saw Leo Brody was with he and Dorothy at the tour of the new galleries of the LA County Museum of Art, you know, which are not yet open, but they'd open the galleries, you know, to preview those. And for those that aren't aware, the LA County Museum of Art has one of the best collections of Islamic art in the country. Like the best collection is probably in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The second best collection is probably the Smithsonian at the Freer Galleries. The third best is here because Linda Komaroff, who for years has been the senior curator of Islamic art, has established a really great collection of art here, and some really powerful kinds of things, including some iconic, meaning like human images there, both contemporary. You think of the photographs, for example, of Shireen Nishat, for example, but other folks, you know, the Persian tradition in particular, where I come from. I was born in Pakistan, the South Asian sort of miniature tradition where you have people's faces, including, God forbid, the prophet's face, other people saying, well, how can you have this? So, you know, there's a really interesting tension among Muslims about the imagery, the artwork, but you're absolutely right, Carol. I think because you want to distance yourself from this community.
Thank you so much. Wonderful student here, Amarachi, and I were talking about the landscape of Islam here in the LA area. So are you finding that there is a growth of Islam in Hispanic communities? And then, of course, there are the African American communities that are.
Yeah, thank you for that. But Professor Kim Harris is a marvelous person in our department, does African American Catholic theology in particular. But yeah, you look at LA, and it's no surprise. I mean, we have Eric Swanson with us, you know, marvelous professor of Buddhism, and I was asking him the other day, because really the person that hired me, actually, the chair of the hiring that hired me was Father Jim Fredericks, who's retired now, Catholic priest, not a Jesuit, as the Jesuits need to point out, but you know, trained at the University of Chicago, you know, marvelous scholar of Buddhism. And he once said, yeah, you know, LA is the best place in the world to study Buddhism. Every single kind of Buddhist community is here. And I asked Eric, is that still the case? He said, yes, you know, every single kind of Buddhist community is here and not, you know, in other places there. Same thing with Islam. And so you've got, first of all, the ethnic communities. I can't remember the number. This is what, like the third or fourth largest Iranian city. So you got this huge, you know, Iranian population here. Not as many South Asians as you have in the East, but that's sort of starting to come. The first Muslims, of course, to America were enslaved Africans, and so you have this consciousness of Islam in African American communities. There's still a Nation of Islam chapter. When I drive, this sounds like an episode of California, when I drive to USC, you know, and you want to go the back way, you sort of go down Slauson to Stalker, and go down Stalker, and you know, get down by Crenshaw and King there. And you still see occasionally Minister Tony Muhammad, you know, in his Nation of Islam bow tie, selling the bean pies and the Final Call newspapers of Nation of Islam. There's a small presence here. But as Professor Harris said, you know, you have this really interesting growth among Latina Muslims, and a couple of times we've been able to have Cesar Dominguez come, and I've said this before, like if Cesar and I were walking down the street and he had a sign around his neck that says, "My name is Cesar Dominguez and I was born in Mexico City," you probably wouldn't say, "I bet that guy's the imam of the Latino Muslim community." That guy's the imam of Latino, which meets right by USC. The mosque, Masjid Umar ibn al-Khattab, right off of Vermont there on the USC campus, basically, is where LALMA, the Los Angeles Latino Muslim Association, meets. And they're 1,000 strong, which is tiny when you think with the number of Latinas in LA, but it's not an insignificant number. So you have that moment. We just lost, last month, Omar Hakim Bey, one of the great African-American Muslim leaders. We were privileged to have Omar, like, literally in this spot, like sitting in this seat a couple of years ago. He did a number of things in South Central, including founding the Humanitarian Day, getting Muslims connected, because you have, and this is a long answer to your question, you have this sort of bifurcated Muslim community in America. What I mean by that is about a third of us are people like me, wealthy, successful, educated, making more than $100,000 a year. About 40% of us live below poverty level. We don't think about those Muslims when we think about the doctors, the lawyers, the engineers, the professors. We don't think about the working class folks. We don't think about like the Cham Muslims who came out of the killing fields in Cambodia, and the Bangladeshi Muslims, and exactly those kind of things, or African American Muslims. And so that sense of what do you do with folks in South Central who aren't wealthy? Talking about Muslim folks, how do you connect Muslims to those folks within the community? And Omar was just extraordinary, and that's just one thing that he did with Humanitarian Day, getting young Muslims to do the kind of work in places that they probably wouldn't have found themselves in, but needed to be in. In the same way that we do that here with our Center for Service and Action, getting students right there in the heart of the real need in LA, and then the Jesuits are here, and they will beat me if I don't mention a Jesuit. Father Greg Boyle, the kind of work that Father Greg does with Homeboy Industries. There's a great thing on the news this morning just about trying to come up with some housing developments there, but for our students, getting the opportunity to go to Homeboy, to go to home, to work with that kind of extraordinary work that Father Greg does is amazing. You see similar things with the Muslim community.
Years ago, I was speaking to a Belgian visitor, and I believe this was to Ohio, and he was taking great pleasure, which he had to explain to me, in the fact that on a particular street there in Cincinnati, there was a Protestant church, and next to it there was a Catholic church. In Europe, at least in Northern Europe, you would never find that, because after the Treaty of Westphalia and the principle that the ruler would determine the religion of the country, there was a great shifting back and forth. The Protestants moved to where the ruler was Protestant, the Catholics moved in the opposite direction to where the ruler was Catholic. And so you had only Protestant churches in one side of the border and only Catholic churches on the other side. But here in America, you had the two on the same street. To him, this was wonderful. There are other examples of this kind of mixing that our country makes possible. We take it for granted, but it really shouldn't be taken for granted. I recall speaking to an American who had made British friends who were here, for business or study. He was now in Britain, and he wanted to get together. He wanted to have a gathering of these friends that they had socialized with in the USA. But it turned out it was only possible to socialize with them in the USA because in Britain, the class system, they wouldn't meet together when they were in Britain. They could do it when they were in America. Really, it just would be not done. Just not done. A Muslim example, Salam al-Mariyati from the Muslim Public Affairs Council is married to Waila, and Salam is Iraqi, maybe Iraqi born, but in any case, Iraqi descent from a Shia family in Iraq. His wife is Palestinian and Sunni. So there was tension at the time of their marriage, but the marriage took place. And that's a kind of mixed marriage, that is more possible now in the USA than it would be in either Iraq or Palestine. Not that it wouldn't happen in both places. I wouldn't be so absolute about it. But this possibility of making alliances and engaging in certain kinds of mixing that is possible in our country. The melting pot, yes, but it's kind of a mixing pot. And what is it? Canadians like the mixed salad image. It makes, I think, the Muslim community in our country a Muslim community that has global importance in the long run. Certain things could begin here that would have consequences all around the world. And you have spoken in other countries about American Islam.
Yeah. So let me say two things there, and this goes back to one of the things Leo started us off with about women's issues. I was still a student, undergrad student in Canada when the Canadian Council of Muslim Women was formed as one of the first sort of Muslim women's organizations, like in the 80s. And I remember, like in the early 2000s, Muslim women in Egypt forming their own thing, and their point of reference was the Canadians. Say, hey, wait a minute, the Canadian Muslim women have their own group. Why don't we have an Egyptian women's Muslim group? And so that kind of work, the kind of work you mentioned, Salam al-Mariyati, coming out of the Islamic Center Southern California, founded by the Hathout brothers, both unfortunately deceased, Maher and Hassan Hathout. But Maher was Egyptian, and when you had the issues post the Arab Spring and the Egyptian issues there between Muslims and Copts, there he was at St. Mark's, the Coptic church, as an Egyptian with the bishop there at the Coptic church saying, look, Egyptians don't need to be killing each other. Here in America, we don't do that. Or, one of the great sort of Shia families in Southern California, the Kazwini family that heads up the Islamic Center by the John Wayne Airport, which is the largest sort of Shia center in the area, doing a thing with Maher Hathout, so this Iraqi Shia family with this Egyptian Sunni family, saying post the Iraq War, yeah, the intra-Muslim violence between Sunnis and Shias, there's nothing in the tradition that says you have to do this. We can get along in America. So using America as an example, and I'll stop here because I know we're at our time, but Jack kindly mentioned Salam and Layla al-Mariyati, and it's sort of fascinating. Here you have this Iraqi Shia guy, this Palestinian Sunni woman. They're also LMU parents because they sent their youngest son, Zayd, to LMU. So I love that.
Oh, really?
We're because again, the Catholic, so depending on where you are, like if you're in Lebanon, the best university in the country is St. Joseph, the Jesuit university. If you come from India, Pakistan, the best, I was talking to John about this, some of the best high schools are the Catholic Jesuit high schools, and Hindu Muslim parents want their kids to go to that school because it's the best school. Sometimes the best school in the country. And so it was this fascinating moment of, here's the son of, the founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council going to LMU. And so they're LMU parents as well there, which is one of the great things about this place. I know we're sort of at our time. I'm not sure Jack said, I'm around, happy to talk with you more. We've got lots of food left over there, so please help yourselves. If you paid for parking, you're welcome to wander around the university. It's autumn day, so the students are around. Please take a look around. Please wander around.
Buy the book.
Oh yeah, you might make some marvelous present. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jack, for being here.